12 hours, 14th of June, approach to the Strait of Hormuz. The sea lay flat and black, the flight deck of USS Eisenhower glowing like a floating city that refused to sleep. Inside the Combat Information Center, recycled air hummed while radar swept the water like an all-seeing eye. On the towed array, a whisper rose, a single blip, fragile but sharp, like a heartbeat in the dark. Fishing boats here crawled at 12 knots. This trace surged past 40, then went cold. Heads turned toward the glass. No one spoke. The bulkhead clock clicked to 03:13. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer held station off the bow. Another guarded the rear, their Aegis consoles painting a quiet coastline. On deck, an MH-60R sat with blades folded, crews strapped, engines one command away from roaring awake. Above the darkness, a P-8 Poseidon was already on tasking. Reports indicate P-8 sorties and sonobuoy patterns are common in this region when contacts turn strange. 60 seconds. That was the margin before the decision. Launch aircraft into the wind or hold the line and risk letting a ghost slip past. The sonar operator steadied his hands on the gain control, telling himself it was only clutter. Yet his pulse beat faster. Intelligence briefs had warned Iranian Fateh-class and tiny Ghadir subs favor this corridor, hugging sand ridges and vanishing inside shipping noise. If the whisper returned on the next sweep, the net would close. If not, the ocean would keep its secret. Either way, the hunt had already begun. Beneath the calm surface, another hunter waited. It was no giant of steel like the American carrier, but a smaller predator designed for narrow seas. Iran's Fateh-class and tiny Ghadir-class submarines were built for this very arena. The shallow waters, the cluttered shipping lanes, the narrow choke points of the Gulf. Sleek and compact, they could hug the seabed like shadows and vanish inside the roar of tanker traffic. Reports indicate such diesel-electric boats can operate in near silence when running on batteries, and under favorable conditions, limited air-independent propulsion extends that silence for days. To the Iranian Navy, these boats were not weaknesses, but perfect tools, daggers in the dark, invisible until too late. Inside one of them, the captain leaned forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the sonar trace of giants above. He knew these waters like a fisherman knows the reefs. Every ridge, every thermocline, every patch of noisy merchant traffic was a shield. In his mind, he was not the hunted. He was the wolf, sliding through coral, patient, unseen, ready to bare its teeth. The hull creaked as the current pressed. Droplets rolled along steel plates like cold sweat. Outside, a dim light from a distant tanker flickered across the waves. But here in the depths, there was only darkness, only silence. The captain allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans might have numbers, sensors, eyes in the sky. But in his waters, he believed, shadows would always win. At 03:19 hours, the first shadow crossed the sky. A P-8 Poseidon, white belly glowing in the moonlight, banked low over the strait, its wings heavy with racks of sonobuoys. One by one, the canisters dropped, parachutes flaring, splashing into the Black Sea below like sparks from a welder's torch. Within seconds, tiny lights blinked across the water, a scattered constellation waiting to hear the ocean breathe. Farther out, an MQ-9B Sea Guardian circled silently at altitude, its data link relaying every flicker of sound, every whisper of movement. Under integrated networks, multiple bearings can be fused to estimate a convergence point. Reports indicate such fusion allows the ocean's vast chaos to narrow into a single dot, a ghost made visible. On the carrier, the Combat Information Center absorbed the feed. Screens painted arcs and angles, numbers ticking down, time sliding closer to zero. Operators leaned forward, faces pale in the glow, their voices flat, steady. They did not cheer, they did not curse. They counted, measured, and waited. Above the deck, a Romeo helicopter sat ready, rotors locked, its dipping sonar prepared to descend into the water the moment the net tightened. For now, it was still. The Poseidon banked again, its navigation lights glinting against the stars, like a hawk circling invisible prey. Down below, the sonobuoys drifted in silence, each one a listening ear. The sailors knew. If the Iranian sub twitched again, those ears would hear it. And when they did, the countdown would begin. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Arleigh Burke destroyer, the air felt heavier. On the big screen, bearings began to converge, faint lines bending toward a single blinking dot. The Spyway-1 radar swept above like a watchful god, its pulses painting every crest of the sea. To the sailors staring at the display, it was no longer a machine. It was an eye that never blinked. The captain stood silent, one hand on the chart table. Under rules of engagement, a show of force may be used when hostile intent grows clear. He weighed the choices: light up the sea with dipping sonar, drop a decoy, or send a USV forward as bait. None meant firing a shot, but each carried the taste of escalation. A small icon flashed on the tactical display. The Romeo helicopter was ready. Another symbol showed a USV sliding out from the shadow of the destroyer, its wake invisible in the dark. The screen pulsed again, bearings tightening, the grid narrowing like a snare pulling shut. The countdown clock in the corner ticked silently. 02:17, 02:16, 02:15, every second closer to contact, every breath shorter. No words filled the room, only the rhythmic buzz of electronics and the hiss of headsets. The sailors knew what the numbers meant. Somewhere below, the Iranian sub was moving, faint but real. And when the next sweep confirmed it, the decision would no longer wait. At 03:26 hours, the Iranian submarine stirred. The captain ordered a shallow change in depth and pushed the throttle just enough to carve a line across the sonar screens above. It was not a real attack, but a feint, a mock torpedo run designed to test the American response. On the map of sound, it drew a bold stroke, like chalk across a blackboard. In the Combat Information Center, the effect was instant. Sonar operators leaned in as a sharp spike tore across the display. The ping was so sudden, so precise, it felt like a steel pin dropping onto a tile floor. For a moment, the room held its breath. The clock rolled to 03:27. Reports indicate that when submarines alter depth and speed in quick sequence, their acoustic signatures can shift dramatically. Under favorable conditions, even a subtle rise or fall creates turbulence and echoes, patterns that can be caught by sensitive arrays. The Iranian captain knew this and counted on the noise to confuse. Inside the steel hull, he sat rigid, eyes narrow, listening to the faint hum of propellers. This was his stage, his waters. The Americans had technology, but he had nerve. Confidence flickered like a flame in his chest. To him, the feint was not weakness. It was proof he could dance at the edge of the carrier's defenses without being struck. For the crew above, it was not yet clear. Was this an attack, or only a whisper daring them to blink? At 03:29 hours, the screens began to shift. The faint spikes from the sonobuoys, the bearings relayed by the P-8, and the silent feeds from the MQ-9B all converged. On the CIC display, dots aligned, arcs bent inward, and for the first time, a single convergence point pulsed bright red. What had been a whisper now looked like a target. The grid was closing. To sharpen the picture, the crew launched a decoy signature. A USV slid forward, emitting a controlled pattern designed to provoke a subtle reaction. Some reports indicate that such decoys can make acoustic triangulation easier by forcing a submarine to reveal its own turbulence under favorable conditions. On the screen, the geometry tightened, lines intersecting like a snare tightening around unseen prey. The twist was clear. The Iranian feint, meant to confuse, had instead painted its position. The submarine had drawn its own outline, and the Americans needed only to trace it. In the CIC, sailors leaned closer, eyes locked. The clock ticked. 03:30. 30 seconds, 29. Breath fogged on headsets. The room held the silence of men waiting for a verdict. On the flight deck, the MH-60R crews were strapped in, rotors ready to unfold. Down below, the carrier surged, steady, engines humming like a beast aware of its quarry. The noose was visible now, shrinking by the second, and everyone knew. Once it snapped shut, there would be no way out. At 03:34 hours, the destroyer made its move. Hatches snapped open, vertical launch cells primed, and the Combat Information Center sent the signal. It was not an attack, but a message written in steel and fire. A vertical launch ASROC pattern can be used as a deterrent under rules of engagement. To those watching the tactical screen, it was thunder waiting to fall. The sea itself seemed to shiver. Acoustic conditions shifted as the ship prepared to unleash its payload. Reports indicate that sudden changes in surface activity can disrupt the water column, forcing submarines to adjust depth and speed under favorable conditions. Beneath the waves, the Iranian captain felt the tremor in the water like a growl through the hull. His instruments danced, pings stacking faster, sonar pulses hammering like a heartbeat out of control. The choice stood before him like a cliff edge. Stay hidden and risk the noose drawing tighter, or maneuver hard and risk being heard. In the black silence of his command chair, sweat rolled down his temple. He clenched the armrest, staring at dials that betrayed him with every flicker. Above, the MH-60R's rotors blurred into motion, a low thunder rolling across the flight deck. Spotlights cut into the dark sea, beams slicing through mist. Sailors on the carrier's bridge leaned forward, eyes locked on the black water that seemed suddenly alive. The countdown clock pulsed. 00:45, 0:44, 0:43. Every second pressed harder on the Iranian crew. They had come to stalk. Now they were the ones being hunted. And the storm crouching above was ready to strike. At 03:37 hours, the ocean broke. Steel plates pushed upward, water foamed, and a black silhouette rose through the waves. The Iranian submarine, once a whisper in the deep, had breached the surface. To the Americans, it looked like a ghost forced to switch on the light. Floodlights snapped on from the carrier's deck, beams cutting across the darkness and pinning the vessel in pale glare. On the tactical net, voices confirmed. Contact surfaced. Under favorable imagery conditions, airborne ISR can enable identification, and the P-8 Poseidon MQ-9B, MH-60R, and shipboard radar all locked onto the target at once. A stack of sensors converged, erasing any shadow the submarine had hoped to keep. On the bridge, sailors leaned over the rails, watching the small silhouette bob in humiliation. It was dwarfed by the city of steel surrounding it, a lone shape caught in a blaze of light. The carrier surged forward, engines steady, as if indifferent to the intruder. For the Iranian captain, the silence inside the hull was louder than any explosion. The gamble had failed. What was meant as defiance now felt like surrender. He had come to stalk giants and ended up exposed, blinded, and overmatched. The Americans did not fire. They did not need to. The image itself was the victory, broadcast across every console and headset. The ghost was no longer invisible. The hunt was over. By 04 hours, the carrier strike group resumed its steady march east. Floodlights dimmed, the roar of rotors faded, and the flight deck glowed once more like a drifting city on the move. The sea returned to black silence, but the memory of the confrontation lingered in every console and every headset. No missiles had been fired, no torpedoes launched, yet dominance had been declared. The mere act of detection, of forcing an adversary into the open, was victory enough. Analysts would later note that under literal conditions, where stealth should have favored the submarine, integrated sensor fusion had shifted the balance. Reports indicate that when networks of aircraft, drones, and ships operate together, even small acoustic tremors can be fused into a precise picture. Isolated stealth, once considered an advantage, had been outmatched by a web of eyes and ears. But the voice of intelligence was less triumphant. They will adapt, one report warned. Iran, or others watching, may change depth tactics, refine noise profiles, or exploit civilian shipping lanes differently. The message was clear. Tonight's success was not the end of the game, only the opening move in a longer contest. On the horizon, the silhouette of the carrier slipped back into darkness, a vast shadow sliding east, its lights receding like the skyline of a city sailing away. Beneath the waves, the defeated submarine retreated, more cautious now, like a wolf limping back into the forest. For the Americans, the feeling was pride laced with vigilance. The ocean had reminded them of its dangers and of their advantage, not in firepower, but in the patience to wait, to listen, and to strike without firing a shot. The ocean fell quiet again, but the lesson rang louder than the engines of any ship. In the littoral, where shadows multiply and submarines thrive, Victory does not always require a torpedo or missile. Sometimes it is enough to shine a light, to fuse every sensor, every ear, every eye, until the invisible becomes undeniable. Reports indicate that under coordinated networks, detection itself can act as deterrence. A vertical launch ASROC does not need to fire. The sound of hatches opening can speak louder than explosions. Tonight, the show of force and the silent grip of surveillance proved that dominance can be asserted without bloodshed. But the littoral remains dangerous. The narrow seas around Hormuz are riddled with noise, clutter, and shifting currents. Another time, another place, the outcome may differ. Adversaries adapt. Technology evolves. The hunter of today can be tomorrow's prey. For those watching, the message is more than military. In the information age, oceans are no longer ruled by tonnage alone, but by data, patience, and the ability to act without firing a shot. And so the punchline stands. In the dark waters of the Gulf, silence can be the sharpest weapon of all. Break it carelessly, and the ocean itself will betray you. If this story pulled you in, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe, so every scenario can stretch beyond imagination and linger long after the screen fades. Remember, this is storytelling, not a playbook. No commander, sailor, or soldier should ever gamble with lives in reckless games of intimidation. The purpose is to illustrate, to dramatize, to warn, never to instruct. Any resemblance to classified missions or individuals is purely coincidental. The intent is not to mislead or glorify war, but to spark curiosity, reflection, and a deeper appreciation for how fragile modern conflict can be.